All right, everybody, let's go ahead and start this. Now, today is election day, and you may be saying, Scott, election day, why are we doing this on election day about demographics and site selection? You may think this is crazy, but it actually has a lot to do with the subject. Not that the fact well, as I'll explain, I'm not really going to talk about projections. I am going to talk about methodology. And that I hope you're going to find really interesting. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we'll kind of start off. And by the way, I'm serious when I say this. I really want you to share this episode with your friends. And I'd love to hear what you think about it, because what I'm doing is getting into some serious science that involves polling and demographic factors. So, and demographic polling and predictions as well. So that's why this is kind of different, and I hope interesting. So what we're not going to cover today, I'm actually going to say, start out with that, which is maybe a little counterintuitive. I am not going to talk about who will win the presidential election. I'm not going to talk about it, primarily because I don't know. At this recording, no one has won. Most of you, by the way, watch this 2 or 3 days after we record it, so you may know things I don't. That's one reason why I'm not talking about the election per se. I'm not going to talk about whether the Senate will change hands, which is hugely important. I'm not going to talk about how soon the COVID-19 pandemic will end. I have been seeing a great deal of epidemiological projections as to what's going to happen. And I think we actually are going to see some serious movement in about 2 to 3 weeks. But I don't know. That's not my field. We're not going to talk about the fate of the US economy by the end of the year, which is also really in play. Europe, specifically Great Britain, has all but shuttered itself today. And we'll see what happens there. And I'm not going to talk about who will win the Super Bowl. Now, I want to explain why I'm not going to talk about why or who's going to win the Super Bowl. Is, first of all, I don't know. I don't even know who's playing. And the other thing is, it's not my business. However, there are some things I do want you to understand. We will talk about the top 10 locations for startup practices over the next 2 weeks. Now, here's my commitment. We are going to do my annual discussion on locations with promise, okay? We will discuss the top 20 places for healthcare practices overall. So one is going to be where to start up, the other is going to be where to purchase, and the last thing is 15 places that have the kiss of death in practices. Now you may say, well, how do you know that? Well, how indeed? The point is, I'm talking about this because that's the business we're in. And we are looking at statistical models that are going to matter. Now, everybody, you're going to want to record what we have or share what we have with others if you like them. If you don't, you'll probably keep this to yourself. But my business is to project the future, and that's what Mike and I are looking at all the time. So I want to talk about why policies are shifting in Arizona. Well, this is more about Malthus. Now, you probably don't know who Robert Malthus is. Robert Malthus was a minister back in 1798. And Malthus had one of the biggest mistaken projections in history, and it's affecting us today. Now, let me explain a little bit about what Malthus did. He made a prediction that said the world is going to starve to death. And he said it was going to happen in the late 1700s, early 1800s. He was predicting mass starvation. He was going to say the only way to overcome that was through pandemics like influenza. He actually thought the Black Plague was rather a helpful thing because we won't all die a hideous death of starvation. He actually advocated for world wars and wide-scale death. And now, quick thing, was Malthus, and who was the predictor of the Malthusian crisis, was he wrong? Well, the answer is yeah, he was. No, we didn't have mass starvation. Pandemics did not wipe out the earth. The Black Plague did not destroy mankind. Hey, I'm not saying a lot of people didn't die. I didn't say that people were going to get through and untouched, but he advocated for world wars. He thought it would be a good thing if we thinned the herd, so to speak, and Mike probably knows what I'm talking about when it comes to thinning the herd. And the question came down to Marxism. Now, there was the idea that we had to enter into a new era in which everything was shared in common or mankind would end. And that is, by the way, what Marxism, the sunny side of Marxism was all about, that we had to have this or we were going to be destroyed. And then he actually, believe it or not, advocated for religious and race wars, the survival of the fittest. And that was a big deal at the end of the 1700s, that certain peoples were going to progress and rise and others were going to fall behind and die. It was the natural order of things, don't you say? Now, he was an Englishman, and that may sound really cruel, but he was actually not such a bad guy. He just thought the only way to get to the other end of the crisis was to pass through this. Now, it's a little bit like a Selden crisis. Those of you who are science fiction readers who have studied your Isaac Asimov, which I'm assuming everybody here has, there were things that could shorten the terrible times that we were going to have to pass through in a Selden crisis. And there are some things that we could do to bring on the crisis earlier or to mitigate it. Okay, now, you're saying, why are you bringing this up on Election Day, Scott? Well, that's because there are some people who see everything as though there's a crisis going on. And I've heard maybe 1,000 times, and that's literal, that this is the most important election of our lifetime. I'll grant you it's important. But if we're talking about projections and trends and the future, there are really two things that we have to take in mind. One is going to be a demographic shift. People have faith that demographics is actually a predictor of the future. Now, I'm not going to say it isn't. I kind of believe it is. I don't necessarily think that we don't have a hand in it, that in fact demographics are changing, they're shifting, but they're not necessarily a good or a bad thing. They just are a thing. But when it comes to political predictions, people are going friggin' out of their minds because they're assuming that humans stop thinking. That if a party gets into power and they really screw it up, that there's no going back. They can't be fixed. There can't be an adjustment. I'm a little more optimistic that in fact they can be. And that's my message of hope to you today on Election Day. Now, let's talk about political and demographic projections and predictions. Now, here's the thing that you're going to have to just acknowledge. In politics, they usually have a fairly short duration. Now, I don't know what you thought about Barack Obama or George W. Bush. By the way, both were predicted to be the end of mankind, that the Savior was going to come in his glory and wipe out mankind in a huge fire. It didn't happen, at least as far as I could find out. But the point is, everybody believed that politics is in fact determinative of what's going to happen in the future. I don't think that. I think, like a pendulum, it shifts back and forth. And there are things that can accelerate or reduce that shift in its speed and its scope. And that is what I know to be true about predictions. But politics, remember, is short-lived. It also tends to have a limited impact. And while there are some people who believe that taking away our guns is going to be the end of the free enterprise and democracy today, or whether we allow it, it's going to be a major shift, I don't see that. In fact, in about an 8-year period of time, a lot changes and people will tend to shift. Now, there are complex variable interactions that happen in political shifts. We know that not all of the United States is in one political party, that there are in fact multiple parties, and there are within the parties different populations that tend to shift. So there may be a right wing or left wing of the right wing and the left wing. That's what I mean by complex variable interactions. That is undeniable. When it comes to doing political predictions, that's where we have a problem. And I thought today would be a perfect day to discuss it, because there are people who are out there trying to make a living and telling you what the outcome of the election will be. I don't really know, but I do know a few things that I believe to be true, and I definitely have candidates that I support or do not support. It doesn't mean I don't have an opinion. It just means predicting political opinions is a risky business. But let's talk about demographic predictions. Doctors, you are trying to decide where to put a practice. Now, in that, you're going to find a couple of things to be true about demographics that I just want to put in context, especially with all these people making predictions. Look, they are longer in duration. Demographic shifts don't just go in 4 and 8 year cycles. They usually take 20 to 30 years to carry out. Now, among those things are shifts of population size and location, wealth, and poverty. Those things don't change as fast as political whims and trends. So they have a longer term duration. They also have an extended impact that is not so easily reversed by the will of the people. No matter how different the people's political will, it's just not the same. So what's going on in China is both a political and a demographic change. Here's the problem or the impact. There is going to be a baby boom. Now, a lot of people are disagreeing with me. I've actually had people say, Scott, you're crazy. There's no baby boom. Well, I happen to know that when you put people together in a home and lock them down, that people will do what people will do. You can quote me on that. Yes. And the thing is, the extended impact on a birth increase is so much different than an economic party change. There's also some predictable variable interactions within demographics that some people don't think about. And I'll give you an example. If people are taxed very heavily in a given jurisdiction, they will move or they will stay. But once they've made the move or they have decided to stay, the variable on people's behavior as tied to demographics is baked in the cake. So here's what I'm saying. You may think people are moving because of politics from one state to another, and that's not true. They're moving because of demographic factors, which are influenced by taxation, cost of living, birth rate. Those are the things that have the long-term impact. So if someone says to me, Scott, I want to know where should I put a practice, I can actually identify 10 states that are likely to increase in population size, in their industrial development, in their housing. All of these factors are longer term than simply a political whim. You get it? Now, I'm going to tell you, not in this episode, but in future episodes, what those states are that are going to show a more promising demographic prediction or factoring than those which are political will. Now, I'm so tempted to go into it right now, but I really should not. And I can say, we can talk about the big states like California, Texas, Florida, New York, but it's actually not in those states that I think you're going to see the most dramatic changes that will affect where you should put a practice or move out of. But we'll talk about it. Give me a couple weeks. Just relax, chill, as we say in Utah. Now, I want to talk about a case study, and that's the case study of bias. Now, you know, people think, well, bias means you're doing something that is showing that you disagree with something or you agree with something and you therefore have a bias. Well, actually, there are several different kinds of bias that are affecting the long-term demographic trends and even political will. and let me go through what some of those are. There is a thing called selection bias. Now, today, no one has announced the winners. It may not happen for a long time. I don't know, a few days, weeks, even months may be needed for people to decide who won the election. But selection bias, where you're trying to predict the future, depends upon the lack of randomization. Now, when people have a desired output, they will tend to put their thumb on the scale and try to say, well, this is what's really important. That's what the factor that really counts. And what they're really doing is taking away randomization. When randomization is lacking, you get bad biases. And selection bias is most often caused when you oversample some people and not others. And that's the next thing. That's what the sampling bias is. Now, the people who are going to be most upset about what the election output are actually those people who over or underrepresented the people upon whom the biases or the samplings were made. You know who gets maddest are those people who did the most to take away randomization. So here's the way you do it. If you ever get involved in statistical sampling, what you have to do is to say, I need to know what reality looks like. Now, I don't know if you know this, but in the United States, and we'll just use the political thing for a moment, they overrepresent or oversample Democrats every single time. They overrepresent that number. Why? Because the outcomes tend to be more dependent upon what percentage of Democrats there were, not on Republicans. They know that Democrats vote, but they don't vote in the same numbers as Republicans do. And for that reason, they tend to overrepresent how many Democrats there are in their sampling. That way, their models will, in theory, turn out to be true. The problem is, many times when they're doing those sampling, they go way too far in time and assume that last time is an indicator of what's going to happen next time. And I'll give you a good example. It was Barack Obama when he was elected president. He was the first Black president, a person to run for president, and the number of people who turned out to support him was far higher than it normally is for any political party. You see, the ramifications of race was overrepresented. Now, you may say, well, how do you know it was overrepresented? Well, I can say that because of what happened after Barack Obama. Barack Obama started in office. He was the first Democrat president in a while, because before that, we'd had some Republicans in office. And he came in. Okay, everybody's very excited. Oh, but then they overrepresented people's passion regarding him as a president, and therefore his success was going to be related to his race. And it wasn't. I mean, that puts an awful high bar on Barack Obama to try to perform. And he didn't necessarily have superpowers. He was just a regular person like everybody else running for political office. And they gave him a Nobel Prize 2 months after being elected. Why? Nobody really knows, but they just liked him and they wanted to give him a Nobel Prize. That predicted something that wasn't in evidence, and that is he was going to have magical powers. He was going to make the oceans levels better. He was going to make the economy automatically change, and a lot of people were disappointed. The same thing is going to be true in this election. A lot of people are going to be disappointed if they put their faith in something that is not based upon fact. Now, whether that's how big an idiot your opponent is, or how wonderful he is, or virtuous, or how powerful, or how wise, the thing is, people get disappointed because they have representations of what they think reality is that isn't really there. So what was the result of Barack Obama? He had a veto-proof majority in the House and the Senate, and unfortunately, they lost it. they lost it just within, I think it was 3 years, that all of a sudden there was a major shift in the party. And that made a lot of people very nervous and very upset. Now, there are some people who are pointing out the fact that right now, the president has got a real headwind when it comes to the media. The media hates him. They will never report good news. And therefore, because of that, there's a certain bias that is put into effect, and people are surprised and disappointed. Now, they're disappointed he is still in office, or that he wasn't kicked out of office when he was impeached. But that whole idea is people's expectations. Now, when it comes to other kinds of bias, as scientists and you're doctors, you know what susceptibility bias is. Who can get a disease, for example? Now, the COVID-19 has far more affected people who are over 75 years of age. The likelihood of staying alive if you're younger than that and surviving this is very different. But it put in place susceptibility bias that people were going to have a certain thing happen that didn't really happen. So another way that this has manifested itself is, yes, people can get the COVID-19, but how many people are dying of COVID-19? Well, in my state, there were no deaths yesterday, and there were no deaths the day before. That doesn't mean people didn't get it. It just means the susceptibility of the disease and therefore resulting in death kind of messed things up. Now, this same thing in immunology happens in politics and to a degree in demographics. So there's some people who are screaming that we're going to be killed and destroyed or whatever, and they're over sampling the idea of susceptibility to a particular trend. You probably know this better than I do, but let's keep going on and talk about a thing called observer bias. And that means there is a certain judgment that people make regarding who wins and who loses. So we all know perfectly well that the people who vote for that idiot are all idiots. Well, not so much. You see, you're assigning a virtue or a vice to the individual who's being examined, and it is according to your observer bias. Now, do you remember when Hillary Clinton said that there is a basket of deplorables? People who are stupid, they cling to their Bibles. Barack Obama said they cling to their guns, they're ignorant. And what happens is the bias is such that nobody wants to acknowledge there isn't a good way to really evaluate whether people are, by their nature, stupid or wise or whatever. And the observer often puts upon them a characteristic that is not necessarily being measured. It's not in evidence. So if you were from the South, everybody knows observer bias means people from the South are just stupid. Well, that's kind of foolish, isn't it? Yet there is a very firm belief that people from a particular region of the country are better or worse than others. There's also a thing called an omitted variable bias. And when they say that, they're assuming that there are variables that are not in evidence or that are in evidence that are simply not true. And it is determined by how much in the sampling you kind of sandwich that in. And that's so foolish. Are all blacks poor? Of course not. Are all people who are of one religion rich? Of course not. But you see, they want to take out the variables that you really should be measuring to determine what they're likely to do. Now, there is a thing called confirmation bias, which is the thing that's on the rise right now. And that is, after this election, someone's going to say, see, I told you. And they're going to do that because they assume that people, based upon this bias, are just confirming what they thought all along. And that is very, very unwise. We recognize the fact that there are some people who are going to riot and burn buildings down, and that's based upon other behavior. But even to confirm or to make a confirmation bias on that is only giving to you what you want to hear. And that is a very dangerous way to make predictions, both in politics and in demographics. Now, ultimately, I'm not going to say Dr. Demographics is the only place that makes projections. We do project based upon trends what direction things are going. We can tell you based upon certain political and economic characteristics of a place what is likely to be a result. Right, Mike?
Yes, that's correct.
Now, that it gets to be a problem if what you're confirming is not actually based upon the realities of the situation. But we track the biases all the time, and there are biases that are demographic and biases that are political. The trick is try to say which one is real, which is a true bias, and which one is going to tell us what's going to happen in the future, and which won't. Now, Mike, you're in southern Utah, right?
That's correct.
Can you tell me anything about what's going to happen in the population size in southern Utah over the next 2 years?
I can tell you based on historical evidence and my
Okay.
feeling for the future, but in absolutes, I cannot.
So you can say what trend is likely to occur, but not how much that trend is likely to occur,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah.
So is southern Utah going to increase in population?
Yes.
It will. Property is inexpensive. Cost of living is good. The weather is good. And the employment variables are also very good. So we know that it's likely to happen. But you'd be unwise to say it's going to grow by this exact percent or by this number, right?
Right.
Now you've got a couple of daughters and a son, right?
That's correct.
And those kids are likely to continue to live out their lives based upon the patterns of their life right now. So you can say they've got a little bit of a head start in doing this.
I'd like to think so.
Okay, you've got a daughter who's in England right now who's going to be going to Germany.
That's correct.
And hopefully she's going to speak German.
I would hope so.
Will that give her an affinity for living in Europe?
Maybe. She does like bread, so.
That's all I'm saying. She also likes cute blonde German boys, right? Am I right?
Exactly. Yes.
All right. So all I'm really kind of getting at is we know that the future by the history and what's likely to happen or what could happen, that's what we're measuring. So everybody, I wish you the best of luck. I mean, Mike and I have got our firearms all primed and ready, lots of ammo.
Locked and loaded, baby. Locked and loaded.
That's right. I'd like to see them come and get the guns out of our
cold dead hands.
That's right. I'm going to have. No. All right. I'm only kidding, everybody. In case you're watching this, don't be offended. But the last prediction I'm going to make is about healthcare. And some people are saying, should I become a doctor? Should I open a practice? Should I buy a practice? Should I have one? The answer is, yeah, absolutely you should. Yes, you're in a great profession. There is not going to be an end to the demand that we have for doctors to serve a population. That is not going to end. Where that population might be that needs service and what the nature of that is what we are measuring. That's all I'm saying. So give us a look at Dr. Demographics to talk about where changes are going to occur, when those changes are going to occur, and the likely amount those changes are going to occur. So you want to know where the population is going, who's going to be rich, where the patient base is going. That's our job. Anything you want to say before we close, Mike?
Now, other than, a great way to do that would be to take advantage of the telephone consultation discount that we have running right now.
What's that, Mike?
Thank you for asking, Scott. If you will look to your email, which many of you are on our list, would have gotten the coupon code. I believe it is Turkey Talk is the name of the coupon. You can save $50 on the telephone consultation, which is a pretty significant discount. And it really makes the telephone consult extremely affordable for anybody, whether you're a student to an old-time veteran, to answer some of these questions for you and get some guidance on not only practice placement, but also practice promotion.
So I just had a person who signed up for the consultation. He's got 3 locations. He's measuring which one's going to be the better risk for me. $50 is not insignificant, but the amount that he is going to save on making sure he doesn't make an expensive error Oh my gosh. It's very smart of this guy.
Yeah. Oh,
All right.
OMG.
So, OM, and what does that stand for? Oh my gosh. Okay.
Oh my gosh, I think. In Utah, it's oh my gosh. I'm pretty
Oh
sure.
my gosh. That's it. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for sticking with us today. And share our website at Dr. Demographics with your friends and at least those people who you like. And we'll talk to you next week. Take care.